Working with the web can be quite difficult if you just started learning iOS development, and if you have no prior knowledge to networking like I had. The most deepest knowledge was, I need a URL to open this website in a browser, but how these URLs are composed and how they differ if you use it in the browser or in your app to fetch data to access the database from your server. This is a topic that most people don't need on their daily basis unless you want to make an app where you fetch cat images, for example. So I'm using this as an example. So we have some nice data to work with and a very interesting app in the end, depending on how much cat you're willing to take in. So in this first part, I'm going to talk about HTTP and requests, how the URLs work, how the communication between your app, some of the basic rules of communication between your application, your client app, and the server where the data lives. In later parts of this series, I'm going to also talk about JSON. So we have a look at how we can get some information from our cat, what we want and what to fetch in which position. So then in the end, we can actually use it in our app to show some images. This API has a free tier, which is quite good. You also don't need to have an API key in the beginning, so we can very easily try this. And they did include here a little sample app that illustrates how we could use the data. You could, for example, use this API to fetch a random image, which I did here under this Votes tab. And then I have here two buttons, love it or nope it. So I can say I like it, which means that you could build some kind of Tinder for cats with the swipe gesture. If I hover here, I also have the possibility to favorite it, get some nice feedback showing that I like this now. This image is then saved, and under my favorites tab I have this one image stored, so I can save some images for later. Under breeds I have here a drop down menu, a picker, where I can see all the available breeds, select one, then it shows me down here some more information, so the description of this breed, some attributes of its social, where it's from, how much it weighs, how long it lives, and they also added here a link to Wikipedia, so I could even learn more about this breed. And there's a little slideshow, so it's also picking up some images. If I switch to a different breed, it switches here the information and it loads a different image. Then we have the possibility to search by images. So again here they added this favorites. So I can favorite this image and then save it here under my favorites tab. Right now it's just picking up random images. For example, I can look for animated images only, for GIFs. It has some nice loading animations. This take longer because the images are just more data. We can go for the static ones. You can also search here by category. And then I would pick up 9 different images. I can also select here how many images I actually want to see per page. And it would change the UI and it would fetch 18 images. Then it doesn't allow me to switch here everything. I can again use search images for this breed. And some of them don't have so many. What does have a lot? We could, if you use this API, fetch here the different categories, with different types and the different breeds, and then use the selection to fetch again information of where to get the images, and then if you want to actually show the image, then we would fetch the image. So it's quite a few interactions with the cat API. Then we have the favorites that I already showed you, and here you can also upload images, and it uses a little bit of machine learning to check if this is actually a cat. I think the API has also some other categories, so you could check what's the image that you're showing. Okay, now I hope you have some motivation a little bit to want to fetch this data. I mean, who doesn't like cute cat images? So now let's talk about how to work with the web. And the resource that I really liked when I was learning about this is one of the developed with Swift books. which I will also use here to talk about it, because they have books that are for students and one that are with teacher guides. So the one that I am using, some of the presentations that I'm using in this tutorial, because it's free material and this is a free tutorial, so I figured it's a good combination. So I'm using, the book is the Develop in Swift Data Collections. I'm using the teacher guide, but if you want to read, it's the book Develop in Swift Data Collection, and you can choose the one for Xcode 12. So I'm just going to open the teacher guide, because I'm using the presentation for that. So it's the chapters 2.4, working with the net, HTTP and URL. So I'm going to talk about HTTP, the protocol, how this URL works, and we are using URLSession to fetch some data. You see this actually working. Then in the next part, I'm going to use here the part with decoding JSON. Then there is a part working with the web concurrency. You need to understand a little bit about Grand Central Dispatch and background queues and how not to freeze your app. So it stays interactive and the user can still do something. So for example, if we fetch our 9 cat images for UI, this can take a couple of seconds. During the time we are loading these images, we can very easily make our UI wait to come back for these images. And waiting means it's not ready to take any user input in. So it doesn't react to changes of your UI, of your user. For example, I cannot switch to a different category during loading. I need to wait until all the images are loaded. This is not a good user experience, and that's why the Apple has a tool for us. This is Grand Central Dispatch, where we can keep our UI active and still fetch a lot of images. They also have a lot of examples in the book, how to work with REST APIs. I would encourage you to have a look. There, for example, they have examples with iTunes or with the Astronomy Picture of the Day API. They can have very nice pictures. After all this introduction, let's talk about the HTTP and URLSession. You most of the time have some kind of base URL. This is, if you use this in the browser, it's usually the homepage that you see. And then if you navigate further, you see the URLs get longer and longer, and there's more complex information that you want to pick. In order to set up some general rules for our client app, our iOS app, and the server, they need to have some way of communicating and saying what's the rules of talking. An API is an application interface. It's basically saying that my computer, my server, is able to communicate to other applications, to other software. And in order to make these different softwares work together, we need to have some kind of general rules, and they also need to be secure. For example, if I log in a banking app, that needs to be very secure. These protocols, these rules of communication can be either HTTP or HTTPS, which is more secure. And you can see this in the URL as the prefix, either with HTTP or HTTPS. If you have now a closer look at the URL, you have usually in the beginning the sub-URL. So in this case, it's finance. After that comes the top-level URL. So in this case, it's pretendo.com. The URL can also specify the port. It has a default of 443, and so far I didn't see any API that I was using where I had to actually specify some other value than the default. After this, you have subdirectories, specific files or subdirectories. So you see here we are in the subdirectory of receivables, and this has a PDF at the end. You could also, for example, have an image. These subdirectories are most commonly referred to as endpoints, and you can navigate quite far down. You can also have, instead of a PDF or an image at the end that you are requesting with this URL, you can also have some search parameters. You can identify the search by this, or the query, by the question mark. And then you have some kind of key value pairs of what you want to search or how you want to receive it. So for example, here I'm saying I have here the name and value. Now let's have a look at what these queries look like in a different context of our cats. So I'm just going to have a look at the documentation. For example, here I said we can search for breeds. If I have a look here, it says here breeds. This is the endpoint or similar, or the subfolder. Similar to this receivables, I can go for breeds. The main domain in this case is HTTPS API. This is the subdomain of my cat API under this path. And then in this case here it's images, search, then the question mark of breeds, saying breeds ID. So what this actually says is I want to have images, and I'm searching images that belong to the breed with this ID. In order to get the breed ID, I can fetch all the breeds. So this is a different request. So again, this is the base URL. And in this case, I'm using the endpoint for breeds. So here they have another example under the documentation of, oh yeah, I have here this breed. There's some nicer UI with tags, the description, and here's some different categories with a rating of, oh yeah, this is a very energetic cat. This kind of endpoints or subfolders you can also see here under API preferences. For example, we have the breeds endpoint, the categories endpoint, the votes, favorites, images. So if I go under breeds and look at here, how do I get the list of cats breeds? So here it tells me one example. In this example, it's again the base URL. Under images, searching breed images with a breed ID Bang. So this is Bengal from Bengal cats. I don't know how to pronounce this. This is a link. If I tap on this, it uses the URL that you just saw and fetch this. And this is a different response because we are not asking for the web page that would return HTML, which the browser knows how to show. This is JSON, it's a different format. And it does look like text. And basically JSON is a text with some formatting rules. I can copy this text in order to see this a little bit better what this text blob is. There's some other websites like the JSON pretty print. So if I paste this on here and then press make pretty, I see here this nested structures. So in this case I said, what did I say? In the documentation they said, use this URL if you want to search for images for Bengal cats. If I go back to this, it says here breeds, and indeed it's having these BENG for the ID for the breed Bengal. There's a lot of other stuff, so it's again returning me the information about this breed. And down here you see there is a URL. If I copy this and open this URL in another tab, I see actually the cat that I wanted. So this is also what we would need to do in the app. If the user selects a cat, we would use the ID from this type to fetch this JSON response telling me the URL with an image, and then I take the URL and I fetch for another fetch I request in the image. Then I said we should look at this kind of queries, and you see here one of these queries working with the question mark breed ID for Bengalian. You can also compose multiple of these queries. If you scroll down under the section send a test request, we can actually test these different URLs. So in this case I have here a get request. So I'm saying this is one of the other HTTP things we need to talk about. I want to get this endpoint for breeds, and I can press here send. So now it's actually fetching the data. And on the body we see the response. So here it says JSON. It returns me the JSON in a nicely formatted way. You can also have a look at the original request. We have here actually a couple of things. It says get, the URL, the headers, and the body. So it's not just the URL that is important to talk to your server, because you want to also communicate different kind of information with different kind of security levels. The first thing is the HTTP method. So what kind of type of request are we doing? This is similar if you think of CRUD. So different operation that you want to do with your database, creating an instance, deleting an instance, updating an instance, and reading an instance. So the reading, just want to access, for example, my cat images. This is this kind of GET request. I just want to get it. I can also say I want to delete something. Then I would change this delete. The URL would look different if you want to delete for something. For example, you would go under breeds and then say ID and then the ID number. It can be an integer or a string, the string that we saw for our cat breeds. So the method would change to delete. I can say I want to create a new breed type. Then I would post it. In this case, I would just say under my breeds endpoint, I want to post a new one. Most of the time you want to have an ID for each of these entities, and the server is supposed to be the one that says which ID this new breed has, because it needs to make sure it doesn't use one that is already taken. So you would just post a new one with an ID that is unspecified, and then the server would come back to you and say, okay, I created this for you and it has this and this ID now. This is different to when you want to change one, because then it already has an ID. Most of the time, post and put are not so separate. So you can also use a put to create a new one, but the response from the server is slightly different. This is one of these rules of HTTP. This is a rule that seems to be not so enforced, depending on the backend engineer who sets up the server. So this is the other thing. Not everything is enforced of this. HTTP means more general rules that most APIs, most server interfaces use, common rules of how to access your data. Then the next thing that you saw here in this original request is the headers. Sometimes you want to exchange data on a different level. For example, you want to make sure that the request comes from a user that's authenticated, that has the rights to access it. And in this case, they use the header to send the API key. This is, as a developer, I can register under their service, I get an API key, and then they know which developer is responsible for this data access. So they can bill me depending on how much of my app is using their service. You can also send password and email authentication with this, or tokens, meaning that once you authenticated the user, for the next request, the user needs to send some information that, oh yeah, it's me again. So that the server knows, oh, this is one user that was previously authenticated that has rights to this and this data points. So that would go in the header. Also, it's different kind of encrypting in this ones. For some of the APIs, they also tell you to put the API key in the URL. So it really depends on, you need to read the documentation of where to put this. And then we have the body. This is, for example, here from what comes back from our server or data of all our breeds. But we could also use the body to for one of these post requests in order to create a new breed. We would add the breed that we want to add, information of the name and description and everything in the body. Use here the post request with this URL endpoint. So URLs is just one part, and what you have to look at is the request. Per default, it's usually a GET request. So again, the HTTP body is sending data to the server, and this is also the content that you get back from the server. For example, this is where your images are, the JSON, the data, the description of whatever you have. Now, let's talk a little bit of how to do this in Swift. We can create a URL from string, and in order to do this communication of fetching data, it's actually not so much work for us, because we can use the URLSession, the shared instance of the URLSession, to fetch data. And here we can either say we have a URL or a request. I'm going to create now a new playground, so you can see how an HTML file looks if we fetch one. So I'm using the same example as in the slides. So first we need to create a URL. I'm creating a URL with the initializer from string. In this case, it's https://www.apple.com. This is returning an optional URL because maybe what I pass here is not in the correct format of an URL. This is an optional, and I'm going to force unwrap this. In the application, we shouldn't do this. We have to decide on a different way of handling when things go wrong. So now I can use the URL session, the shared instance. So this is the instance that manages all of the standard, the default instance that manages all of the fetches. So if you access this shared instance of URL and you fetch multiple images, the URL session, this one URL session, would manage the resources in order to fetch all this. So it's internally optimized to manage multiple fetches at the same time. You can also create a different session and customize the default behavior and configure the session a little bit more, but I'm not going to do this. We will continue with the default behavior, and I'm going to tell the URL session to create a data task with URL, and I want to use the completion handler because in the completion handler, this is a closure, we get access to the returned response. So the URL I want to use is the one we created here. What I get back once this request is finished is a data. So this is a data blob, something of type data that can be optional because the data is the things that is in the response body. Maybe there's nothing in the body, so then it would be null. For example, if there's an error occurring, this is the error from the session. For example, if we don't have an internet connection, we would get here an error. So this is also, but we not always have one. So again, this is an optional. We also get the response. The response gives you some information of how well your request worked. Maybe the URL that you use doesn't exist. The response has a status code telling you what went wrong. For example, if the page doesn't exist, the status code is 404. We can also have a look at this if something goes wrong, because this is a potential error with a different kind than the error we get back from our URL session. So this by itself doesn't start a task at the fetch. So it returns here a task. In order to start the task, I need to say task.resume, let task, and then task.resume. So now let's have a look at what is in there. I said this data can be nil, so I'm using here if let statement to check if I have some data. If let data is data. And now we have this data blob, which I cannot really humanly understand. So I like to have a text returned here. And we can create a string from this data. So this is file, because the string has an initializer from data with encoding. So I'm using here the data. And the encoding is UTF-8. This is a standard file format. So if I have a data and if I can convert this to a string with this encoding, then I'm going to print it. So now let's run this. You can scroll here and see the HTML file. To scroll to the very top. So you see here HTML, the language, prefix, some settings. So this is the whole HTML file, which you usually, if you are a browser, would be able to use properly. In case you don't see this, there is a little bit of a problem with URL session because this is a long-running asynchronous core, and the playground doesn't like to work with this because it's preferring one time running through and then finishing instead of waiting here for this one task. Import, so I have to set something with the playground. Import playground support, playground page.current.needs indefinite execution is true, so it tells the playground to keep on running. I want to finish eventually. So when my completion handler returns me my data response or error, I'm telling my playground page, the current one, to finish execution. So then it will stop running. This is probably not the most exciting of things to see. So let's try to use some of the cat API things. So for example, here I'm just going to copy one of these URLs. It does, if you're looking here under query, it did add a couple of query parameters, so you also see how to format this. So I'm just going to delete the page and the attached read. For example, I can give a limit. I don't want to have all of them. Maybe I just want to have 5. If you then look under code generation, you see it changed here with the query parameter of limit 5. Or I can just delete all of these, and we take the basic URL to fetch this. And under code generation, if you select your Swift, you can also see an example of how to create this. And again, with the URLSession, with the full example, if you have an API key, you can add this, but you don't need to do this for testing if your requests are very small. They give you a certain amount of free data. In this case, they used a request, set the request and the headers, but the default HTTP method is anyway get, so I don't really need to set this. It's just more for you to know what they actually do. I don't need to add the API key in the header. So I really only need to use the URL. They use the NS URL. This is if you're on a Mac. It's more general. I'm just going to use this URL. So I'm just going to use a different URL with this breed types, and we run again. And I need to force unwrap this again. And now you see the JSON file as a text without much format. This is pretty long because I didn't put a limit to, it's giving me all the breeds. So there's a lot of data, and somewhere there is also name in there. Or we can change this to it was before with a query, and I'm just going to type this per hand. So the query is question mark and then limit 5. So maybe we start with 5. So now I have here a lot less, or you can just put 1. So it's a bit easier to know what you get back. So in this case, it gave me back the first one in the array that it has, which is the Abyssinian. Probably should have chosen a cat that I can actually pronounce. You can also see the same response here if you run this on the documentation page. Usually they have, for all this information that are in the JSON in the return file, they have some kind of list of what is in there. So this is on the top here, this response. Response 200, as said, there's a response code, and 200 is usually good. So you can also see here what would be returned. For example, one example. Here you see all the information. Oh, okay, this has an ID of this 4-letter ID. This is the name, the wiki URL, then these kind of categories of hairless, and you see here there's some numbers. So if I go back down to hairless, in this case it can be either 0 or 1. Probably would have preferred a Boolean value of saying is it a hairless one or not, because otherwise I need to know does 0 mean it's hairless or 1 means it's hairless. They also have here categories like dog friendly. This can be between 1 and 5, so minimum maximum gives you the values. This is what they were showing. Here under search by breed, the breed name, and you see here there's dog friendly and this cat has a 5-star. The number for the property dog friendly must have been 5 for this one. So depending on how much information you want to actually know about this cat breeds, you can use this. Just go through here all these attributes and what type they are. So you see here the ID is a string, the name is a string, hairless is an integer. Usually they also tell you if it's an optional, so that would be in a JSON a null value. So here under images, get an image. So in order to get this image, you would need to give the image ID. The response would give me back the creation date, original file name, the URL, and also the information of the breed that image belongs to. This is probably nice if you fetch random images and the user is like, yeah, actually I want to know what cat this is now. And on this test request is returning here a status of 400, telling me couldn't find image matching this ID. Yeah, because There's probably no image with image IDs. It's not a good example here. But at least you see possible return that didn't go so well. So the other thing that you might want to request is these images. So here under get all public images for this request. So again, here under queries, I can decide what I want to have. Maybe I want to have a limit of 8. This is, no, 9. Like in the example where you saw this grid of 9 random images. The category IDs is this, I didn't actually show you this. Here under search by category, you can fetch the different categories like cats and boxes. This is not, something went wrong with the rescaling. It does show me here tiny images. There's probably some problems. There seems to be something wrong with the scaling right now. But let's... So you can, in each of these categories, there's a category ID that you can also use. Say I want to fetch the images for this category. But right now I said I just want to have 9 random images. And if I send this, I get here a JSON file with images, information about these images. I would get an array of images. So the array is in JSON this corner brackets. And each of these objects in this array is with curly brackets. So this is one image, this is one image. And you see in this case, one of them does have information about the category it belongs to. The first one doesn't. For example, this one belongs to boxes, this one belongs to hats. This one, again, doesn't give me information. But the interesting thing is here the URL. So if I have then the URL, for example, just going to copy this one, and you put this in the browser, you get these images. How does that look like if I use URLSession? In this case, I know that whatever comes back here, the data, this is a very generic data blob, because it might be a JSON, a text, an image, a video, an MP3 file. So that's why the return time is this generic data, some data. So we need to get similar to here where we transform the data to a string. Now transform the returned image to the data for this image to a visible image. Starting off again by creating a URL from string, and I'm using the one that I just copied from the API. You can use any other image if you want to. Then I need to use URLSession, shared data task for URL with completion handler for this URL, which I need to force unwrap. So now the return data here, I should be able to transform to an image. So I need to also say task.resume. So again, if this is optional, so I need to check if I have a data, if that data is a data, have something. I want to have an image, and we can use UI image, which I only have if I import UIKit or SwiftUI. UI image. And the initializer that is interesting in this case is data. You see it takes a data of type data and returns an optional image, because maybe the data thingy is not something that I can convert to an image. So I'm using this. So now if I have a data and if I can make an image out of it, I'm going to show this here. So I'm just printing success. And in order to see this a little bit better, E is image. I'm just going to copy this here to another property. After a couple of retries, I have now here a print statement saying success. You can see the images if you use here the right side bar inspector. And there's one in the line where I have this image. So I can press here on this eye and see the image, or on the pad. And then it shows here. You can also make this a little bit bigger to see all the information. If you paste the same URL in the browser, you should actually see the same image. So we change this, and it's the same one. I talked quite a bit about the URL and how to use URLSession to send this request or this URL. This would be actually the same as if you have here a request URL request from URL. And then to this request, we could add here the header method. So I'm just going to use the default anyway, which is get, which means that it has to be actually a var if I want to change this. And then, as you saw in the API, we need to add the API key, if you have one, in the header file. So we can add this fields to the header with the all HTTP header fields. This is an array of key values. So the API key would go in here if you have one. And how the system knows this is an API key, we have to use the same style here. So under code generation, you can see the header file, the value where I have to give my key is x minus API key. It has to be exactly the spelling. So I would need to use here this key and then add and I would use the key that they sent if you register. So if you, for example, choose here sign up for free, they will send you an email with the API key, and that you would paste here and add it to the header field. And then instead of data task with URL, I would use the with request. So it's still the same completion handler and data. So in this case, it still returns me something. This is because I'm guessing they're just ignoring my weird API key that I added here. So I'm just going to comment this out to not confuse that this is supposed to be adding your own one here. In the documentation, you see here this JSON file, and in the body, there's also the 200 status code of the response was good, meaning the server could, with your request, create a response. In order to see this status code, we can access this from the response in the completion handler. This is again a optional, so I'm using a if let statement. If let response is response. And in order to see the status code, you cannot directly see this here. You can access the URL, for example, from this response. That was the original URL that you sent. I don't see the status code, and this is because this type URL response doesn't have it. But if we typecast this as a HTTP URL response, now I can check the response, and it has a status code field here. In this case, for this request, I receive a status code of 200, which is good. As long as it's between 200 and 300, it's okay. So we can check that, for example, between 200 and 299 is our response's status code. So we are checking if the status code is between 200 and 299. If this is the case, then I can just proceed normally. So I just want to make sure that when things go wrong, if my status code is not okay, then I want to get more information here. So I'm using the inverse of not. If it's not between 200 and 299, then I want to get here my print statement. Or additionally, we could also throw here an arrow and use this arrow, or maybe for something with more information of what went wrong. So we can then later use it in our UI to give the user feedback of maybe the data that you try to access wasn't there, or the server might be not available. Even if you don't know what's going on, you can always give feedback of saying, we're sorry we couldn't process your information, please try again later. But in order to actually know that things go wrong and not that it's just like, because otherwise if you don't check this, you might not know if actually you just don't get a feedback that because you don't see your data coming back, but you need to get something back to know to repeat this request or to change the request. And we can also check the error. So if we have an error, we can print the error. So if you say the error, this is usually localized description, so this has more some information what went wrong. For example, you don't have an internet connection. We could also use the localized description to show it in the UI for the user in an error view. So he knows that his internet connection doesn't work and tries to reset it or check what's going on and then come back to the app and retry. But we need to tell the user what's going on. and we need to ourselves know what's going on. So it's quite useful to check the response, meaning our URL or request was weird, couldn't be processed, or the error. Later on, we also have another thing, which is how to deal with this data. Because right now I don't only have a JSON here, and just a string value. I'd rather have my own Swift struct that I can easier use for my UI. So we need to do some conversion from JSON to a Swift type. For this, we have to work a little bit with how to model our data and how to use Codable. And this is what we are going to do in another section, so we can actually use this information from our cats that is in the JSON currently. You can find the link to the next part of the series in the description box. So in the upcoming part, we're going to get to know more about our cats. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. See you next time. Happy coding. Mini-me. Mini-me. Mini-me.